thank you everyone for signing in today. So I'm Vivian Greenoff. I'm an associate ecologist at WYG, and I head up our South East ecology team spread across 2 offices, which is London and Guildford. And today I'm going to talk about Biodiversity Net Gain, what it is, how it will likely be implemented within developments and the planning system. So firstly, what is Biodiversity Net Gain? The definition is development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before, and an approach where developers work with local governments, wildlife groups, landowners, and other stakeholders in order to support their priorities for nature conservation. So how can it be achieved on site? It can be achieved by creating new habitats within a site, or perhaps you can enhance existing habitats within a site. You can also achieve it by managing existing habitats in a better way for wildlife. So one such example of this would be mowing regimes. You could leave some parts of a site to grow longer, and while others are mown on a rotational basis. Net gain also talks about off-site as well, and that's a key thing to remember, is it isn't just to do with within your site. More on that later. So what is the policy legal position? So the National Planning Policy Framework says that planning policies and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural environment by minimising impacts on and providing net gains for biodiversity. So the NPPF used to say no net loss. However, the wording was added in 2018 to now say net gain. It isn't compulsory yet, but what we're finding is that a number of local planning authorities have started to adopt net gain in their local plans and policy. And then in the spring statement last year, the Chancellor's spring statement, it was announced that biodiversity would be mandated for all development. And Schedule 15 within the Environment Bill now modifies the Town and Country Planning Act. And this says that every planning permission granted for the development of land in England shall be deemed to have been granted subject to the condition. And the condition is that the development may not be begun unless the developer has submitted a biodiversity gain plan to the planning authority, and the planning authority has approved this plan. Now, once again, this is not a compulsory requirement yet, because the Environment Bill hasn't yet been passed through Parliament. So which local planning authorities have started to adopt the net gain approach? So early adopters of this were Warwickshire and Nottinghamshire, and they are really leading the way, particularly Warwickshire. And then what we're also finding is that some local authorities have bespoke policies in place. So though they're not entirely compliant with the government plans, there are some which have their own policies. An example of this is in Essex. Essex has supplementary planning guidance to do with biodiversity restoration and net gain requirements for mineral development. And then Dorset County Council applies biodiversity net gain requirement for all authorities within the county for any development over 0.1 hectares. And then in Lichfield, their guidance stipulates that a 20% net gain is required for development proposals which have an impact on key ecological features. And then also there are developers that have taken this approach as well. An example of these is Barratt Homes. They have a internal policy in place where all their developments must meet net gain. And then also large infrastructure and utilities companies such as Balfour Beatty and HS2. So what our GIS team here in WIG have started doing, we started compiling all of the local policies and plans and mapping them across England so that we can see which local boroughs have adopted net gain and which ones haven't. This is a working document. We're updating this all the time. But what you can see on that plan is that the darkest green in colour is local authorities which are following the standard NPPF. But then the ones in the other colours are local authorities which perhaps have emerging plans which have net gain in place, or perhaps ones which already do. And we're keeping a track of this closely so that we can look at our sites that we're working on almost immediately and advise our clients as to whether a net gain will be a requirement. So when will it be mandated? Well, The true answer to this is that no one really knows. We're expecting the Environment Bill to receive royal assent by the end of 2020. However, given that we're now within a global pandemic, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets pushed back a bit. I think what's really key to remember is that obviously we had an election last year, and all of the main parties had biodiversity net gain within their manifestos. And there was no real objection to the net gain approach by any party. So it has generally been accepted that it will come into effect, but the key question is that we just don't know when. So it will make it a compulsory requirement for all development to achieve a 10% net gain, and it probably won't come into effect straight away. We feel there's going to be a 2-year transition period, but again, it's very unclear what this will entail. We also believe that it probably won't be applied retrospectively to sites which already have outline planning consent. And we expect that there will be some exclusions. So for really small developments, or maybe for existing types of permitted development, it may be that the net gain requirement isn't required. So how does net gain work? So the key thing to take away from biodiversity net gain is that you have to use a metric. It has to be measurable. So what we mean by this is that you use a calculator to ascertain what the value of your site is pre-development. And this is measured in what we call biodiversity units. It also requires an ecology survey. And this survey is more involved and a bit more in depth than what we normally do for our phase 1 habitat survey. And this needs to be done by a competent and experienced ecologist. So this is the process. So to calculate your number of biodiversity units you have in your site, you have to do a number of steps. The first step is to go out and identify the habitats which are present within your site. We then measure the area and the lengths. So area-based and linear habitats are assessed separately within the calculator. So when I'm talking about linear habitats, I'm talking about streams, rivers, hedgerows. The third step is that we have to assign the habitat's distinctiveness. Now, this includes parameters such as the species richness, so how many of one species there are within a habitat. Now, when I say species, I'm talking about plant species as well. The species diversity, how many species there are, the rarity of those species and the rarity of the habitat, and the degree to which the habitat supports species which are rarely found in other habitats. Now, all of this is predefined within the calculator, and the table there on the screen actually shows that habitat which has high distinctiveness, this would be such as a woodland, a habitat of principal importance, would automatically score 8, whereas a habitat which had low distinctiveness, which would be habitats which aren't really protected with any policy and have not much biodiversity value, they score 2. So we then go on to look at the condition of the habitat. And this is where the survey is key, because we cannot assess the condition of the habitat without having actually done a survey on site. And again, once again, the condition of each habitat is assessed following criteria, which is which is assigned into 3 categories. You can have good condition, which gives you 3 points, moderate, which gives you 2, and poor, which gives you 1. It depends on the habitat, and there's a huge documentation and guidance that we follow, but to score good condition, all but 2 of the criteria must have been met. To score moderate, you're looking at several of the criteria having failed. And to score poor, it means that most criteria have failed. And what's also important here is that some habitats, such as arable land, will be pre-assigned a poor condition, again by default. Final steps that we look at to gather the baseline is we then look at ecological connectivity and strategic significance. So ecological connectivity will look at things such as, so it leads me on to the next slide, such as green infrastructure plans that some boroughs will have, or ecological connectivity. And the map I've just shown you here is the Hampshire Ecological Network map. And this can be really key in providing what your strategic significance and what your ecological connectivity score, if you can look at where your site is in relation to these green corridor maps. Now, many local authorities have already produced these plans or are in the process of producing these plans. So what is key here is that we need to engage with the local authority, we need to engage with stakeholders to discuss the site and the project, and to talk about the wider conservation actions which are happening in the local borough. So once we've collected all of this existing data on your site, to get your number of biodiversity units that you have on site at the moment, you times the distinctiveness by the habitat condition, by the area, by connectivity, and by the strategic significance. And that outputs your baseline. So once you have your baseline, so your number of biodiversity units you have on your site, what you then need to do is to calculate the post-development biodiversity units. And to do this, you will need to know how much habitat is being retained and what is the future management going to be on that retained habitat. How much habitat will be lost and what new habitat will be created. Now, the next step of the calculator adds in what they call risk factors. Now, the risk factors are the time it will take to get to target conditions. So if you're creating a new grassland on site, what is the lag time for that new habitat to get up to the target condition? It will obviously take several years for a habitat to establish. And also, what is the difficulty of the restoration or creation of the habitat? Some habitats are easier to create than others. It'll be very dependent on the environmental conditions of the site as well. So what this highlights is that it isn't a simple like-for-like replacement. If you are losing a certain amount of habitat, to compensate for that habitat, you will need to create more habitat, so a larger area, in order to compensate for the loss of biodiversity units. So once we have this information, we insert all of that data, the post-development data, into the calculator. And it times the distinctiveness by the condition, by the area, connectivity, strategic significance, and then adds in the two risk factors, the time to target condition and the difficulty in the creation or restoration. And this will output your future biodiversity units. And the final step is, have you got a net gain? So after the baseline has been minused by your post-intervention, your post-development units, if you get a positive value, you've got net gain. And if you get a negative value, you get net loss. But remember that 10% net gain will be required. So even if you have a positive value, you need to calculate what the percentage is. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take you through a very high-level example of a net gain assessment. I'm using the land which is adjacent to our Southampton WYG office. It's a fairly small parcel of land, less than a hectare, 0.78 hectares, and phase 1 habitat. As you can see, most of the site comprises semi-improved neutral grassland, and then you've got a couple of parcels of broadleaf woodland. And when we ran this through the calculator, you have an existing baseline of 6.6 biodiversity units. The woodland makes up 0.97 of a unit, and the grassland makes up 5.63. Now, if we then put in the post-development, so on the screen, the brown is the development footprint, so basically a building. What we got was you actually got a total of 3.48 biodiversity units left, which actually equated to a 47% loss. And then we reran the calculator to ascertain, well, what would we need to change on site? How would the footprint need to change in order to achieve a net gain? And this resulted in a decrease in the development building footprint. And we also put in some better management of the woodland and the semi-improved grassland. And we managed to achieve 5% net gain. Now, this isn't to scare anyone. It's simply just to tell you that for small sites, it could be quite challenging to get net gain. However, it is possible. And for a site like this, which is less than a hectare, you'd be looking at your adjacent habitat as well and looking at whether you tweak your red line boundary, and you potentially be looking at off-site compensation as well. But yes, for small sites, biodiversity net gain could be more challenging than for your very large development master plan sites. So this leads me on to, what happens if within your development site you can't achieve net gain and you do have a net loss. This is where you would start to look at providing compensation within the local area, within a site, off-site. You'll frequently come across everyone calling this offsetting. And what's important to remember is that biodiversity offsetting is no different to net gain. It is part of the net gain assessment. It's not a separate process. So if you have net loss and you need to offset, there are a number of opportunities at the moment where a developer can offset the loss they have within the site by going to an offset provider. And these providers will sell conservation projects that deliver biodiversity units which a developer can buy. This is usually, it operates where the developer pays a sum of money per unit, for example. So if you had 20 units you needed to make up, there'll be a cost per unit. So they pay a sum of money to the offset provider, which could be a local planning authority, conservation group, or a wildlife trust, as required to achieve the 10% net gain in units. Or alternatively, if the developer owns some other parcel of land, they could enhance that and maintain that and to offset a development project they own. I think what's key to mention here is that offset providers aren't available in every borough or every county, so it very much depends on where your site is as to whether there is an offset provider available. But what I'm anticipating is when net gain is mandated, far more opportunities will start to crop up. So some key points to take away. So the biodiversity net gain does not negate the need to follow the mitigation hierarchy. And what I mean by mitigation hierarchy is the first steps is you avoid and you retain your most important habitats. If you can retain the most ecologically valuable habitats within your site, that is the number one method to minimise the net gain requirement. The other thing to bear in mind is that you cannot get net gain if you remove an irreplaceable habitat, and that would be an ancient woodland. So it doesn't matter what compensation you did, if you've removed an irreplaceable habitat, net gain isn't achievable. You also cannot get biodiversity net gain if you adversely impact a statutory designated site, such as a site of special scientific interest, special protection area, or a SAC, which is Special Area of Conservation. And even common habitats such as semi-improved horse-grazed grassland, as we saw in the previous example, may require a lot of compensation to achieve the required net gain. So to take you through some of the limitations that exist with the calculator. The calculator only looks at habitats. It doesn't take into account animal species, which can cause conflict. So if you recall me saying arable land scores quite lowly in the calculator, you could have a situation where you have an arable field which scores really lowly in units. However, it could support a significant population of a farmland bird population. What's also worth noting is that the net gain assessment, it is not a simple task, and it's a separate piece of work. And it actually takes as long, if not longer, to do than our standard ecological appraisals. To get an accurate assessment, we need design freeze and we need a fixed red line. Whenever there's any changes to the proposals, development footprint, or changes in the red line, the calculator would need to be rerun because even small changes in area make quite a substantial difference to the output of the calculator. Contrary to that, you actually want to run the assessment as early as you can. You want to get the baseline as early as possible because you need that to feed into the layout of your master plan, and you need it to give an early sort of indication about whether or not net gain is achievable on site or whether you need to start looking at off-site compensation. There's obviously also a degree of professional judgment as well. Landscape architect master plans don't use the same habitat types as we do, so we have to convert them, and this could introduce some error. And there are many, many metrics out there. So the most common is the DEFRA metric 2, and that's what most local authorities do seem to be adopting. However, there are some local authorities out there which actually have their own metrics. And what you'll find is different calculators, even if you insert the same data into all of them, they will output different things. So we need one calculator to have a fair and consistent approach for everyone. And again, you need an experienced ecologist. You need a condition survey. So again, it's need an experienced ecologist who is familiar with the process so that they can advise on some of the tricky, more complicated parts of the calculator. So there will be opportunities for developers in Biodiversity Net Gain. One of the main opportunities would be for land that can't be developed. This land could be used and enhanced for net gain, and then you could sell biodiversity credits to other developers which need them. This could work on an undevelopable site, such as a site which has got contaminated land issues. The government has actually indicated they want to stimulate an economy in biodiversity credits. The other points would be that it's good practice in marketing. New developments these days, there's a real push on providing open space for new residents, having open green areas. It could be a good marketing tool. And then, of course, standardisation across the country. If we have one system and one policy in place and one protocol, then you're making it a fairer place for developers out there because everyone's in the same boat. So my final slides today are going to talk about how biodiversity net gain can fit into a multifunctional landscape. This is really thinking about your large master plan sites. So one such example of this will be sustainable urban drainage systems. SUDs are a way of managing surface runoff and pollution from development sites. And the potential for net gain here is high. And this is because SUDs often require large areas of space. And in the metric, wetland habitats actually return a lot of biodiversity units. Now, there will be things to consider because obviously some SUDs will be better for ecology than others. A SUD which is dry for half the year won't score as highly as a SUD which has water contained within it all year round. So the key thing here is that the ecologist really needs to understand the SUD system well to be able to input the most accurate data within the calculator. The second one is public open space. So in many local plans, the provision of public open space is another requirement. And this can tie in well in that the public open space can be a dual function, could also be used for net gain. Examples of this could be community orchards. You could replace amenity grass road verges with species-rich grassland. However, once again, conflict could be caused, recreational impact from dogs, cats, habitat degradation, and of course we need to consider public safety as well. But anyway, like SUDs, these areas are, can be used for net gain. However, they're probably not likely to achieve a high target condition, but there will still be opportunity. Species mitigation. So for sites which actually have protected species on site, such as great crested newt or dormice, part of the legislation and the license for those sites will require the developments to maintain favourable conservation status of those species. And that will be, the habitats will be retained, they'll be enhanced for those species. And of course, that does tie in really well with the net gain approach, because if you're retaining habitat for dormice and great crested newt, that will contribute to your biodiversity units on your site. So yeah, we feel if you've got dormice and GCN, it might actually be a good thing for your development sites when net gain comes in, because it's likely that the 10% will be more achievable. So just to finish off, really. So with biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory, many developments will probably require an increased amount of habitat creation. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that developments will become unviable. There are other land use requirements for developments such as SUDs, open green space, and these do tie in really well with net gain. Consider net gain as early as possible in the project planning process, even at site selection viability stage, because as soon as you have a good understanding about what's on your site, your ecologist can then start informing you on the design, layout, and what mitigation you may need to do. Key is to engage early with ecologists and all other disciplines, and to work closely together to get the all-round outcome in view of the available resources on a site. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time. I hope that was of interest to you, and more than happy to take any questions you may have, or alternatively, you can contact us via email as well.